should let everybody know that many know my story. It's not exciting. There's nothing tremendous. There's not going to be any jumping out of planes or police chases. So just try and stay awake, and we'll see what God has in store. I know that I am extremely fortunate to be born into this country. I know that I am blessed and highly favored to be in this land, this one nation under God. I'm proud of the fact that our founders were godly men, that they wrote within the creation of our nation and the documents that we still use today that God was in charge, that God existed, and that everything that we have, we are given through His grace and through His mercy. And I'm proud of the fact that the first book that our country ever requested that was approved by Congress was a printing of the Bible. A fact that gets lost today in a world that becomes increasingly more secular and trying to distance itself from God. I have met righteous men and women in my life. I'm very fortunate to have met Amy and been blessed to be able to be a part of her life, and Kristen and Madison, and the newest addition to the family, Alfie. I was born in Tennessee, but I wasn't born in Giles County. And usually when I say that to people, the first thing I hear is, wait a minute, you mean you moved here on purpose? Well, we lived in Birmingham and then to Huntsville and then to Tennessee. But I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I know that some of y'all may never have heard of that little city. But I have an older brother and a younger sister. My mother was an amateur photographer. My father was an enlisted aircraft mechanic in the Navy. He worked on aircraft carriers. I'm sure you can imagine with those high-producing jobs that we had access to a huge salary that meant that we lived in a great neighborhood in a town that is known for its great neighborhoods. Well, other than some memories about bagel bites, I don't really have anything good to say about the first few houses that we lived in. I don't remember much fondly. My brother's 5 years older than I, and unfortunately he was old enough to remember and to get involved in some things that still haunt him today. He made some bad decisions because of the areas that we lived in. We moved around a lot. We lived in a few neighborhoods that some of you may be aware of. I'm sure Mike could tell y'all some stories about Fraser and Highland Heights, which is where I grew up. If you ever want to hear those stories, just don't. One day, while at sea, on active duty, my father was on an aircraft carrier. He was blown off of the side with a deck wash. That's a normal procedure, but through accident, negligence, I don't know what it was, he ended up going over the side. He didn't make it to the water, fortunately. He survived, but I don't know how long he hung from the side of the aircraft carrier from what's called a metal rope, which was basically a giant piece of wire clinging with his fingers. It was a pivotal moment in his life, and he did not come back home the same. Excuse me. It changed him, not for the better. He went AWOL. I don't know if y'all know what that is. If you don't, it's called absent without leave. It's not good. He was dishonorably discharged from the Navy, which cost him many future benefits, meant that he had a mark that would follow him for the rest of his life. Because of my love for my country and respect for the men and women who have defended it, who have fought and died to keep us safe, I was ashamed. And for a long time, I carried that shame, thinking about what he did and what he didn't do. But when he came home, he was different. He found drink. He became an alcoholic. He was a mean drunk. Many times, myself or my brother, we got to feel his frustrations. Fortunately, my younger sister was too young to receive some of that. But during those times when he did have a job, it was not uncommon for him to spend whatever money he had earned on alcohol and to come home drunk and angry with no pay, not being able to pay the rent. And the amount of times that we would leave apartments or leave places because we had to, we were evicted. Fortunately, that did come to an end. It didn't last very long. My mother, who was barely 5 feet tall, stood up to my 6 foot tall former enlisted Navy father and threw him out of the house. He disappeared for a long time after that. We kind of moved from place to place, and eventually we landed in what was the first decent neighborhood, and it meant being able to play outside, which is something that's important to a little boy. It meant being able to go to the same school and to regularly attend synagogue. If you're unsure of what that means, I'll let the cat out of the bag. I'm Jewish. I come from a Jewish family on my mother's side. My father was the only Christian in our immediate family, or so-called Christian. In fact, I did a DNA test that said I was 51.8% Ashkenazi Jewish. The rest is mainly British and English. For a little while there, I had South African and I had about 4% Viking. I know y'all don't care about that, but I thought that was great. The most recent update took my Viking away, so I've been a little bit sad about that. But I don't really look like a Viking, so I guess it's fair. The Ashkenazi number's never gone down, though. Our lives had begun to develop the kind of stability and normalcy that's good. My mom had gone back to school to get her degree in teaching so that she could have a better job. She worked evenings at MCI, if you remember MCI WorldCom. She worked evenings there, and sometimes she worked for the Psychic Network. That's not a joke. She did anything she could to make sure the bills were paid and food was on the table. My brother had kind of continued down the path that he started on, something that's not uncommon with broken homes, families that grow up with single parents without present fathers. One day, a few years after the divorce, a pipe split on the second floor of our house. It flooded about half of the second floor and all of the first floor. We didn't have renter's insurance, and 8 to 10 hours of water flowing uninterrupted was enough to pretty much destroy everything. The home was rendered unlivable. My mother couldn't afford to fix it. We didn't have anywhere else that we could go. We lost our home and most of our possessions. You know, it's weird the things that you remember. I can remember being upset that my Super Nintendo was ruined and that I no longer had Zelda and Super Mario Brothers. And my Magic card collection was ruined and my collection of the Boxcar Children books. Just the weirdest things that you remember. You know, I wasn't concerned about having a place to live. That's just things that the kids don't think about, which is good usually. I can remember sitting in a dumpster at about 11 o'clock at night with my brother while we dug through piles of trash and drywall and destroyed clothes, trying to find things that weren't ruined. My Uncle Burton, who, meaning to be helpful, had called a disaster recovery service so that my mother wouldn't be responsible for the repairs. But we didn't know that, and they came in without any notice and threw everything away. I mean, you'd think most of it was ruined, but when you don't have anything, you'd be surprised what value little things can develop. We moved in with my grandparents. That was definitely the best moment of my life. I've told some of you about my grandfather before. He was an amazing, God-fearing Jewish man. He dropped out of school to get a job to support his big family during the Great Depression. He followed a hawker. I don't know if you know what that is, but basically there was this guy who had a horse-drawn wagon, and he went up and down the streets of Memphis in the 1920s, hawking out that he was selling ice for people's ice boxes. Remember ice boxes from before we had refrigeration? You literally just had a box with ice in it to keep your stuff from going bad. That's what he did. The little boy would jump off of the wagon and carry ice over to people, and they would give him the money, and then they would keep going down the road. I remember him telling me that he made 5 cents a day. And I remember thinking, well, you can't buy anything. You'd work all week long, and you couldn't get a mint. Of course, little me didn't understand that money was different back then. But that money that he could bring in from working with that man was enough to help keep his family afloat. When he became an adult, he started to sell brooms door to door. That's really exciting too. I mean, just imagine the joy of getting up every morning to knock on people's doors and say, hey, do you need a broom? He went from selling brooms to getting a job in a lumber mill where he swept up sawdust so that he could then sell the sawdust when he was selling the brooms. Cleaning supplies and things like that didn't really exist the way they do today. And he could take the sawdust, which he got for free from sweeping up in the sawmill, and could sell it to people to help to clean up spills and things like that. This was the beginning of the company that he started that eventually was known as Weil Chemical Company, that employed hundreds of people. He manufactured and created chemicals. He engineered new cleaning formulas without even a high school degree. His work, his effort allowed his children to grow up in a completely different environment than he did. They were well-to-do. They were members of the country club. Their school was paid for. They got cars when they became adults, all those great things. They led successful lives. My mother was the black sheep of the family, where both of my aunts married strong Jewish men who they were married to until the day that they both respectively passed away. First my Uncle Roy and then my Uncle Lou. My mom met a man who was supposed to be a Christian, but he let us down. The bar for Christian men in my eyes had not been set very high. I didn't have examples of a father until I met my grandfather. I didn't know what men were supposed to do, how they were supposed to act. My brother didn't either. My sister didn't know how men were supposed to treat women. My grandfather stood in that gap. He shared with me his work ethic. He held me accountable. He was something entirely new. He was there. He encouraged us. He was everything my father was not. Riding with him to synagogue and listening to him tell stories about what it was like selling brooms door to door, what it was like to employ family members who didn't really work. It made me aware of the person I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to be more like him than like my father. He was a man of humble beginnings who, again, with not even a completed high school education, would read books about Einstein and physics at home. He would cry when someone gave him a gift because he felt he'd done nothing to earn it. He introduced me to Rabbi Harry S. Danziger, who was the rabbi at our temple. I now had two amazing, godly, patient figures, true men of God. My brother and I studied and began to learn Hebrew. I was given the Hebrew name of Ari Ben-Yamin. Amy still occasionally calls me Ari sometimes. I spent time in the Torah. I watched my brother do his bar mitzvah, where even his mistakes, which definitely seemed worse than mine, could be forgiven and accepted by God. I cannot speak enough about my grandfather, Rabbi Danziger, who patiently encouraged us and showed their fervent love of God through their actions, not through words that didn't have any meaning behind them. They were determined to make us better men than our father had been. I felt God through their presence and their behavior. I was 13 when my grandfather passed away. It felt as if my whole world came crashing down around me. I was still so young. My time with him had been so short. I did not understand why God would do this, why he would take him away from me, from us, why leave my grandmother and all of us without him. My mother, my aunts, my uncles, even Rabbi Danziger, a man who I still love and respect, could not shake me out of my sullenness. I decided I didn't want to proceed with my bar mitzvah. I didn't want to go to synagogue anymore. I didn't realize what happened then until much later in life, and my brother also struggled. About a year later, Rabbi Danziger retired, and I went to synagogue with my grandmother, but it wasn't the same. About a year after that, it was September 11th, 2001. I was 16. I think everybody in here that's an adult remembers where they were that day, remembers what they were doing when they heard the news. It was more than I could handle. Something broke inside. To be faced with the knowledge of such evil, such hatred in the world, was more than I knew how to handle. I still not recovered from the loss of the only father that I knew. I began to argue with everyone, to start fights with anybody over anything, to lash out at friends and family, to get into fights at school. It was a regular thing for my mom to get a call to let her know that I'd gotten into another fight with another random person about another thing that didn't matter. I began to lie, and I became the worst version of myself, cold, cynical, negative, stubborn, uninterested doing anything that I didn't see the value in. I made one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I dropped out of school. And I've made a lot of mistakes, so I count that one to be a pretty big one. I had fully entered the wilderness. It wasn't 40 years, but it was a while. I met Amy. We became friends. She was married to Chris at the time. That's Kristen and Madison's father. We would sometimes, the three of us, play computer games together. I watched how another Christian man behaved. She was kind of the polar opposite. She found it fascinating that I was Jewish. We actually met because she sent me a message that said, "Merry Christmas." She sent a message that said, "Merry Christmas" to everybody. She asked me how my Christmas was, and I said it was terrible. She said, "I'm sorry to hear that. Why was it so bad?" I said, "Because I'm Jewish." And that's how we met. But she found it fascinating that I was Jewish. And over time, I stepped out of the cave of misery that I had surrounded myself with. By now, I was an adult, and I realized that one day, I looked in the mirror and I thought I represented my father more than I represented my grandfather. And I decided I had to be intentional. That I couldn't just go through life this way and expect to be the man I wanted to be. I quit starting fights. I got my GED. My brother, unfortunately, continued to spiral downward. I remember at 19 years old driving to South Dakota to pick him up from jail, where his car had been impounded for a drug possession charge. A few years later, I did the same thing in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, picking him up and bringing him home. Chris and Amy eventually separated and divorced. And like I said, they were both Christian, but they were completely different in their actions and faith. He was another Christian man who did not take care of his family or his children, but Amy was different. She's kind, she's patient, she's forgiving, which is necessary around me, because, everybody on that back row can tell you I'm hard to deal with. And many people in here, it's not exclusive to them, unfortunately. But it was necessary that she was those things because I was none of them. I have to constantly remind myself not to act like the person that's inside who tries to get out. And Amy was my stability. And she had this really annoying habit of asking me constantly about Christianity. She would not let it go. She pretty much witnessed to me nonstop. No, I'm Jewish. I don't believe in that. Christ seems okay, but I don't believe he's anything other than a nice guy. I'm still waiting on the Messiah. I firmly consider myself a Jew. I have no interest in learning anything about Christianity. Drop it. We started dating. We broke up. We remained friends. She moved back to Florida. She completed her law degree, started working for the Justice Department. I would come down for the weekend sometimes and visit. I remember watching the girls when she was out of town. That's when I found out that Kristen loved confectioner's sugar. She didn't say confectioner's sugar. She said, "Ooh, I love confectioner's sugar." We're not Catholic. Anyway. She gave me a New Testament Bible, which for some reason was massive. It was large print. I mean, like that thing was like a cinder block. I read all the time. I have great vision. I mean, I like nonstop reading. Like when I was in school, I'm walking home, I got a book in my hand. I'm not paying attention. I mean, I never got hit by a car, so I must have done something right. But I mean, 3 or 4 books at a time. I loved reading. But she shows up with this Bible that's got size 3,000 font. It's like 1 word a page. It was huge. And she makes me promise to read it, and I say, okay, I'll read it. I don't know why it was so big. I guess she wanted to beat me with it if I didn't, learn. I don't know, but I read it cover to cover, and I told her I didn't care. I'm Jewish. I'm firm in my faith. But it didn't matter if we were seeing each other or just friends, because she never gave up. She continued to witness to me. And that was not one conversation. You have to understand, this was a long-term campaign. This was not like you witnessed to somebody, you're like, oh, I tried. Let's go get some dinner. I mean, this was like day after day, week after week, month after month, years of her not giving up. She was in the Lord's army, and she was on multiple deployments. She'd bring up her faith and ask me questions about mine, and eventually I'd get mad and tell her more than once without hesitation, I'm a Jew. I'm not going to convert. I'm not a Christian. I'm never going to be. I'm never going to be. I'm never going to be. Has anybody ever said that? I'm never going to do something? Don't say that when God's listening. It didn't stop her. She didn't listen to me, which I'm thankful for. Or I should say that she listened instead to her Heavenly Father. And she prayed. God in heaven, how she prayed. To me, the matter was settled. I'm Jewish, and you can ask me a million times, and it's never going to change. Around 2008, my grandmother had what we could only describe to be like a stroke, and she changed. She could still communicate, but it was different. I used to watch sports games with her. She loved football, golf, tennis. I've never understood how somebody could sit there and watch golf, but she would do it. She loved it. I mean, playing golf is one thing, but watching it on TV, goodness gracious. Tennessee game, she loved the Manning brothers. So wherever they went, she rooted for them. I drive her to Bridge Club. We talk politics. She was a hardcore conservative, which is unusual for Jews, by the way. Y'all don't realize that, but for whatever reason, it's true. She needed full-time care, and the decision was made to move her into my Aunt Barbara and my Uncle Roy's house. They were both kind of like partially retired, so they could be home full-time. And when they went out of town or went on vacation, I'd go and I'd stay with her, and we'd make breakfast and talk and watch more golf. I was so close to her. I can remember having conversations with her. And one time she called me Ernie. That was my grandfather's name. That's a humbling experience to be compared to a man like that. About a year later, in 2009, my father resurfaced for the first time in probably 15 years. I was an adult. I had 2 jobs. I had a full-time job and a part-time job. Part-time job at Borders Bookstore, if you remember that one. I really only worked there for the discount. I went most of my paycheck and some of my paycheck from my full-time job, which was at a locally owned computer and AV rental company owned by another Christian man, self-proclaimed Christian. I've been working there since I was 18 or 19. He proudly cheated on his wife, didn't hide it. He walked around dropping racial slurs that I had never even heard of. Like they were going out of style with no shame. And Memphis is a town with a little bit of a background when it comes to racism. So you hear a lot of stuff, but he had some new ones. Once again, the bar for Christian men had not been set very high. But Barry Bates showed up, and I don't know if I've shared this to everyone, but I was not born Benjamin Ernest Wheel. I was born Benjamin Ernest Bates. When I became an adult, I had my name legally changed to reflect my grandfather's last name because I felt like he was more impactful in my life. I compared one man's character to another. The Christian that willfully gave up on his family and the Jewish one that at 85 years old said to his daughter, "Bring your 3 loud, obnoxious, ungrateful children into my home and everything will be okay." And it was. Of course, he didn't actually say that, but he was 85. He had raised his own kids, worked his entire life, sold his company, most of which he donated the proceeds to charity. But while the bar for Christians had not been set very high, seeing him there was another reminder of the difference. I was angry. To say that I was just angry seeing him pop up after 15 years would be an understatement. The Ben that I try and keep locked away, the angry, harsh, cold, cynical one, he made it to the surface, and I let it out. I unleashed years of anger, frustration, and disappointment. I told him to get lost, and he did. For some reason, I didn't feel better. It didn't make any sense. I should have felt better. Yelling at him and telling him what I thought of him didn't improve my relationship with him. It didn't help my brother or my sister with their problems, and it didn't help my mother, who by now had basically become a hermit, locked away in her house like she belonged on one of those hoarders shows. It didn't make sense to me that after holding on to all that anger and resentment, finally being able to let it out didn't improve the situation. Let's fast forward another year. He's been gone. You remember the flooding in 2010 in Nashville? I had a bunch of jobs in Nashville. It was a regular thing. I mean, you could ask Amy. Every day or every other day, I was on the road to Nashville, coming back to Memphis, back to Memphis, back to Nashville. We had about 25 jobs that were planned for several different big conventions that were supposed to be in town that week. And, well, you know what happened. They got a little bit of rain. 4 different rivers flooded. The city of Nashville downtown was underwater. Low-lying areas like Opryland were under 10 feet of water. Well, if only we'd seen the storm coming, if only we'd known that would happen. Oh wait, Amy had warned me because she loves the weather. She said, "I don't think that's a good idea." And I said, "Well, I'll talk to Doug." Doug didn't care. He said, "The clients haven't canceled, so we got to go." So myself and our crew of 7 loaded up our trucks, and we took off for Nashville. About halfway there, I-40 was shut down. They weren't letting anybody go. 3-hour drive ended up taking 11 and a half hours. We finally made it to Nashville. It was probably 2 o'clock in the morning. And the only place that I could find that had rooms available was the Super 8 Motel in a really awful area. I felt like I was in Orange Mound. It's like being back home. Wasn't good. They didn't have enough rooms, so I had to room with Dave. Dave was a super nice guy. He called himself a Christian too. He struggled with alcohol, he smoked. He was an exceedingly nice guy. He would do anything for you, give you the shirt off his back. But he definitely struggled with a lot of different vices. So we had 2 different beds. He was in his bed, I was in mine. He was sleeping, I was not. He's a large man. He's a very large man. He needed a sleep apnea mask. He sounded like an asthmatic water buffalo climbing up a hill, stuck in the mud. It was bad. After about 4 hours of trying to fall asleep, I went outside and slept in the back of a van. And I still got better sleep than I did the whole time I was in there. Big surprise, most of the contracts were canceled. I finally get to make my way home. It's the end of the week. Get a phone call. My grandmother had passed away 3 days ago. They didn't call and tell me because I was in Nashville and they thought it would be too much effort to try and figure out how to get home. So I missed her. I went to the funeral, but I missed her. My anger did not diminish. It was a hot Independence Day in Memphis about a year later when at a fireworks show where Kristen, Madison, and Amy had come up to see a place that I'd watched fireworks at since we moved in with my grandparents, which is still my favorite fireworks spot to this day, by the way, outside of the backyard or Disney World, that I proposed. I asked her to marry me. I don't want to keep you in suspense. She did actually say yes. I lined up a new job. I started working for Apple remotely. I moved to Birmingham. That's where Amy and the girls lived. She was working in the Treasury Department. And you know what happened the moment we got married and I walked into that door? The campaign resumed. The witnessing, the discussions about faith, about being Jewish increased. If I thought the previous campaigns had been like the shock and awe, then this was like that on steroids. I would ask her questions and then explain to her why she was wrong. But for whatever reason, she didn't stop. She persisted. She told me stories about how Madison was saved in the back seat at a Sonic restaurant. She told me stories about how Kristen, when she was in the womb with her difficult pregnancy, all the experts took Amy and said, "There's no way she's going to survive, and you're going to die if you try and give birth to her." They told her to have an abortion. She said, "Shut up and don't ever talk to me about that again." She had to face it nearly alone because, as I've mentioned, her husband was not the best. He was selfish. But to have that much faith in the face of all of that, that's an example. To say, "Not my will, Lord, but yours. Do with me as you see fit." We still lived in Birmingham. We were going to drive down to visit her family in Florida. It was lunchtime. She brought out the big guns. We're going to go pick up lunch, and her father, Charlie, walked up to me and said, "Hey, Ben, why don't you come with me to pick up this food?" Sure. I love Amy's parents, by the way. They're stable, they're loving, they were always welcoming to me. I mean, I'm not saying that there's not some crazy stuff, because what family doesn't have crazy stuff, but you hear the in-laws jokes, but they never applied. They really never applied. I mean, maybe she thinks about my mom, they do apply, but, and that's not, I'm serious. But anyway, why don't you come pick up this food with me? Okay. Charlie and I drive to one of Florida's premier restaurants. It's a 5-star restaurant formerly known as Tasty Freeze. The Big T. It's now known as Saucy's. All I can say about this place is if you don't know what it is, I'm sorry. I'll pray for you, and you should plan a trip to Milton, Florida. But if you know, you know. Charlie was a Christian man. Charlie is a Christian man. He was a pastor. He's one of the first Christian men that really lived the way that they preached. We talked the entire time. I didn't know if this was planned by Amy and Charlie. I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know. I've never asked, and I don't really want to know. I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that whether they were in cahoots or not, God was working the situation, as He did every step before and every step since. We made it back to her parents' house with about 43 tons of chicken tenders, white gravy, fried green tomatoes, and buttered Texas toast. You can't say it was all unhealthy because the tomatoes are green underneath the breading. It's a true Southern delicacy. I didn't talk to Amy about the conversations I had with her dad. I didn't want to give her more ammunition. Incidentally, all the food was gone the next day like manna from heaven. I'm just saying. It never makes it through the night. A couple weeks later, we were back home at our apartment in Birmingham. It was early December. I was working long hours for Apple, which made me probably very pleasant to deal with. Working overnight shifts are always fun. We were arguing about something that probably didn't matter. It was early December. I can only assume it was Christmas budget, what we're going to spend on gifts for people. Amy is exceedingly generous. I'm exceedingly cheap. I have a tendency to be very stubborn. Mules can learn a thing or two from me. I could not stop thinking about the conversations that I had with her father. She was pretty frustrated with me, reasonably so. I'm sure I was being stingy, and that's how the whole thing started. But that's not really what it was about. It was not because I was cheap or I hadn't budgeted enough, but because I was not being the man that God wanted me to be. I had not made her feel safe or shown her the respect and appreciation that she or the girls deserved. I was holding on to something and not letting God lead me. She sat on the bed. I was waving my arms, gesticulating wildly like a crazy person, pointing at imaginary charts that were in my head about the budget and how much we were going to spend and what the impact would have. And that's when it hit me. I remember putting my hand back behind me on the nightstand or the table and felt something on the table. That large print Bible. Why is it so hard for us to agree on something so trivial? Why is it becoming this big of a deal? What was missing from our communication? She can get along with anyone. Why is it a fight with me? Why am I so angry? Why am I so cold? Why am I so harsh? I decided so long ago not to be like my father. I don't drink alcohol because he was an alcoholic, and I've always been afraid that I would have the same effect. I can probably count on one hand the number of drinks I've had in the past 10 years. So it's not like I was letting something change me, right? What was wrong? Or was I letting something change me? I wanted to be like my grandfather, but if anybody in here with an outside perspective was watching that conversation, you certainly would have known what influence I was following, and it wasn't my grandfather. I put my hand on that book with a soft leather cover. Time stopped. I know people say that. But if something like that has ever happened to you, you know what I mean. Time stopped. It's like the world slowed down, and all of a sudden I had the freedom to think. The river that was in the back of my mind had quieted. That same Bible that I had promised to read cover to cover, that I did, but I didn't tell her that before I opened the first page, I had already made up my mind. My heart wasn't in it. I didn't care. And then I realized I was looking up at Amy, which made no sense because she had been sitting on the bed and I was standing up. But I was looking up at her and my eyes were watery. She wasn't on the bed anymore. She was standing up in front of me. I was on the ground. No, she hadn't clocked me. She hadn't got up and pushed me over. I just was standing and then I was on the floor, crying. What's wrong? What's wrong, she said. For the first time. In almost 13 years since my grandfather had passed away, I was aware. I knew it was wrong. I understood the missing link. I didn't feel God anymore. When I moved in with my grandfather, I became connected with his synagogue. When I began to learn under Rabbi Danziger, I started to appreciate his love of God. It went away when he died. I was mad. I was angry at God. Then my rabbi retired, which doesn't sound like it's a big deal until the one that replaces him is a poor substitute. The congregation shifted. It's hard to describe what that means if you didn't grow up in that temple, but Harry Danziger believed in the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Bible. He taught out of that. Micah Greenstein, who took over, believed that faith had to be intertwined with human reason. He felt that God's laws were not necessarily immutable, and some laws were not binding. I know now what that was, but 14-year-old me didn't understand that kind of evil yet. Perverting the word of God. I didn't know where to go. Maybe I would have found the right spot on my own if I hadn't fallen to pieces a year later when the country was attacked. It was just more mounting anger, more frustration, more resentment. Why would God let innocent people, defenseless citizens, be killed? Not soldiers. People just going to work. My heart had been hardened, and I did not realize until I was sitting on the floor of an apartment in Birmingham that I had not felt God's presence since the day my grandfather passed away. But God did not abandon me. I abandoned him. I lost all control. I was crying. I was deep in despair. I knew I had no right to ask for a relationship with him because when he tested me, I had failed. I turned my back and walked away. But he didn't leave me. No matter how far I walked, he was still there. The seeds which had been planted were ready for the harvest. I asked Amy what to do. It was fitting that she was the one that was there. I prayed the prayer and the weight was lifted. The release that came from that was more than just recognizing God again. It was realizing that the anger and shame that I had held on to for so long, I realized I was no different from my father. I didn't have to drink to be like him. I didn't have to spend my paycheck and deprive my family to be like him. But like him, I had been tested. And like him, I had failed. I had emotionally and spiritually neglected my family. I was not the man that God wanted me to be. I was not the leader of my household. I had been cold and harsh to them. My father was tested when he was blown off of that aircraft carrier, and he failed the test of faith, allowed drinking to take over his life, and I allowed bitterness to take over mine, to take over my love for God. I judged my father, which I had no right to do, when I should have been empathetic, prayed for him. When he surfaced, I didn't give him a chance. I let the worst part of me take over, and I told her about that and how I didn't want that to be the last thing that he and I had ever said. It had been almost 4 years at this point since I had seen him. That would make it almost 20 years since he walked out, and we'd seen him one time. Had not heard or seen from him since. We talked and prayed about it, and I knew what I needed to do. I needed to let go. I had to release the hate. I could not allow the enemy any longer to make use of me, to mask God for me. Over the next 6 years, I tried to find him. Addresses, phone calls to numbers that were disconnected. By now, Amy and I had moved to Pulaski. I had called a number recently and left an answer and got nothing. I left a voicemail, rather. He called me back a few days later. The dam burst. I told him I'm sorry. I apologized to him. He was the one that wasn't there, but I'm the one that refused to let him come back in. I apologized for the way that I acted when I last saw him. He told me I didn't need to apologize, but I told him I did. I let it go. Amen. I told him that I wanted to have a relationship with him, that I was married. I had 2 wonderful children, and that all he had to do was pick up the phone and call anytime, and I'd be happy to talk to him. He told me about his life, what he was doing. And I told him if he wasn't in the area anytime soon, we'd go visit him. I never heard from him again. About 4 years ago, my sister called me, which is a rare occurrence, to tell me that a friend of his had found him passed out on the floor of his apartment. He was pronounced dead on the scene. I can't imagine how I would feel right now if I hadn't let that go. I will stand before God one day and I will have a lot to atone for. But I knew that I could have a clear conscience with that situation. I'm still new as a Christian. It'll be 15 years in December. But I'm unashamed to admit that I can still be moved to literal tears pretty easily when I think about the sacrifice that was made for me. Sometimes it's the stupidest stuff, like a song. But I can still be moved by it. I'm by no means perfect. I'm still a sinner. I still lose control of me and let the jerk out, what I call him. But I proudly stand before you today as a Jew who believes in a Savior who was born of a virgin, lived a perfect life, died for my sins, rose 3 days later, and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Life is but a vapor. Every moment of it is precious. I would ask every one of you to never give up. Continue to pray unceasing, to witness to those who you know are not saved. Plant the seeds. I am eternally thankful that neither God nor Amy gave up on me. And I have been blessed by many godly Christian men since then. Many of them here in this church. I've been very fortunate to know Bill Alexander. When all the stuff happened at the association, I rose to his defense because he was a godly man who was trying to do God's work. But he got caught up in the same kind of nonsense that happens to all of us. I met David's father. I got to work closely with him, Bobby. And I was fortunate to be able to call David a friend as well. Men like Toby, who are some of the goofiest people on the planet, but who live his faith and walk it out. I have been blessed and highly favored. I am a high school dropout from a broken home in Memphis, Tennessee, but that is not what makes me who I am. Through Christ and Christ alone, I am blessed to have a wonderful family, a beautiful grandson, a job that makes me travel too much, but I'm still blessed. All because somebody didn't give up on me. So the only thing left that I want to say is sow your seeds. The harvest is ripe.